And this second one is called the essay, the Manifesto and the Poetic Imagination. And Anais Duplan and Tracie Morris and Raquel Salas Rivera are all going to be presenting. And I'm going to read their bios. And then they'll just go up in their alphabetical order, alphabetical last name. I guess it gets a little confusing. So Anais Duplan is the author of a full-length poetry collection, Take This Stallion, and a chapbook, Mount Carmel and the Blood of Parnassus. Their poems and essays have appeared in Hyperallergic, on PBS NewsHour, the Academy of American Poets, Poetry Society of America, Fence, Boston Review, The Journal, and in other publications. Duplan is also an artist and curator who has facilitated exhibitions at the Distillery Gallery, Elastic Arts, Disjecta, The Radical Abacus, Public Space One, and at Menji in a city in Iceland, which I won't say its name, but starts with an R. Their visual works have appeared or are forthcoming in group exhibition at Flux Factory, Thomas Rabitello's Gallery, Data Editions, the 13th Baltic Triennial in Lithuania, and the Institute of Contemporary Art in LA. Duplan is the founder of the Center for Afrofuturistic Studies, an artist residency program for artists of color in Iowa City, and is the Joint Public Programs Fellow at the Museum of Modern Art and the Studio Museum in Harlem. Tracie Morris, MFA from Hunter College and PhD in Performance Studies at NYU, is the author and editor of 7 books. Morris is an award-winning interdisciplinary artist, writer, and vocalist, fellow of Yaddo McDowell Millet Creative Capital and Asian Cultural Council. Installation presentations include at the Whitney Biennial, New Museum, Philadelphia Museum of Art, venues, galleries on 6 continents. Her most recent book is Who Do With Words, which is published by Chax Press this year. Raquel Salas Rivera is the 2018-2019 Poet Laureate of Philadelphia, the 4th receiving that title, I believe that's right, for a 2-year appointment, which is very exciting, all the work that will be done. Their work has appeared in journals such as Revista del Instituto de Puertorriqueño, Apogee, Boat, Circolo de Poesia, Cosmonauts Ave, Waxwing, Dregenald, and the Boston Review. They are the author of Crónica de Angelos Turbios, Orpel/Tinsel, and Tiaro Intermiante. Their book, Lo Terciario, or The Tertiary, is forthcoming in 2018 from Timeless Infinite Light. Currently, they are the co-editor of The Wanderer and co-editor of Puerto Rico en mi Corazón, a collection of bilingual broadsides of contemporary Puerto Rican poets. If for Roque Dalton there is no revolution without poetry, for Raquel there is no poetry without Puerto Rico. And I just wanted to start as a little invocation before they come up and give their presentations, just a little passage from Oskar Kokoschka, the painter, and he writes, consciousness is the source of all things and of all conceptions. It is a sea ringed about with visions. My mind is the tomb of all those things which have ceased to be the true, hereafter into which they enter, so that at last nothing remains. All that is essential of them is their image within myself. The life goes out of them into that image, as in the lamp the oil is drawn up through the wick for nourishing the flame. So please join me in welcoming Anais Duplan.
It's really lovely to be here with all of you and with these mind-bogglingly, is that a thing? Mind-bogglingly amazing poets. So thanks. So I had this issue where I initially wrote this presentation and I thought it was going to be long enough, and then it was way too short, so then I added some stuff, and now it's way too long, so I'm just going to start. This is what I used to look like in 2014. It's crazy. In autumn of 2014, alongside my two friends and collaborators, I wrote customized manifestos for strangers. I got this. Every year at month-long symposiums held in cities around the world, the Utopia School connects people through urgent conversations, performance art, and free workshops with titles like Intro to Code for people who don't necessarily like computers, and What We Need is Beautiful and Free. The year was 2014, and Utopia School this year was being held at Flex Factory in Long Island City. My friends, Daniel Fryman, Keone Kochi, and I had come up with a 2-day performance called Manifestation, where people signed up to fill out a questionnaire and then spend a half an hour with us in our interview booth. We got a variety of people, old and young. We asked folks questions like, what are your hopes? What are your fears? Who are you? What are your interests and passions? What do you want this manifesto to accomplish? We learned a lot about people in those short interviews. It didn't take long for people to open up. Maybe it was something about the softness of the curtains we'd hung up, or the comfort of being at an event like Utopia School, where you know that everyone else is weird in the same ways that you are. One former physician told us about his difficulties rejecting his parents as an adolescent, about his preoccupation with ancestor worship, and his experiences reading R.D. Laing. I think of R.D. Laing, he said, in The Politics of Experience, where he talks about how children are born, that they're innocent, good, and that immediately their parents, schools, etc., set out to make them feel alienated from themselves, from everything, finally from the earth. If people didn't act this way, we would not even be able to conceive of a nuclear holocaust. I think about the idea that someone thinks they own a plant. I was at this party once, it's outdoors. This flower is withering and it's going to die, but you can't turn the sprinklers on because there's a party going on. Plus, the zinnia belongs to the host. I went inside and got some water and watered it. I knew that was considered not right. After the interviews, Keone and I would get together to talk about the people we'd met and how we might write a manifesto for each of them. We hoped these documents could empower people to pursue the dreams they already themselves held. In the years after that performance, I began work on Black Space, a book of essays and interviews about the strategies that Black and POC writers, artists, and musicians have used or can use to work towards psychic and social liberation. I had conversations with poets like Wendy Xu, Francine J. Harris, Fred Moten, and Nate Mackey. In my conversation with Mackey, I mentioned revisiting his book Blue Fossa before our interview and feeling blown away by a quote of Baraka's that he'd included in the book's preface. It read, "New Black music is this, find the self, then kill it." I asked Mackey how we might approach that question as a truly two-part question, part one being to find the Black self, part two being to kill it. I include Mackey's response here at length. That is a statement of Baraka's that I've pondered over for years. One of the things that he meant by that was, in the course of improvising and getting to the point where you can play free music, you have to find yourself. You have to find out what your sound is. It may be something innate, but you have to practice and find what it is, where it is, and how to get it out. And how to translate it through a horn or a piano or a bass, whatever, which you likely call technology. How do you technologize yourself? How do you utilize that technology to render something that may be unspeakable or there before not spoken and maybe unrenderable? How do you get out a version that at least approximates that self and at the same time registers your refusal to be satisfied that you have properly and authoritatively or with some finality articulated that self? You have to take that self into the interplay and dialogue and conversations and sometimes debate and contentious interaction, which I think we're learning today, that is involved in playing in an ensemble. In some ways, you have to be prepared to lose that self or even to be an instrument of losing it, which is to say, to be killing it. That means getting beyond what your prepared repertoire of selfhood is. That's some of it, but that's not all of it. It's also in the context of a kind of socio-political ensembling that was going on at the time that we were involved in. There was tumult among black folks during that period. This is around the mid-60s, that had come out of the civil rights movement. One of the things that was involved was finding a self, looking at the self that you had and coming to see that it had been fashioned by social relations that we wanted to obliterate. The whole regime of white supremacy and the social mores and instructions and folkways that kept that in place. You had to look at the extent to which you were compliant with that shaping. The self that you had found yourself to be was, in some way, a creation of that regime. Killing it would mean fashioning a new self that would be in conflict with that regime and that wants to bring about the destruction of that regime. The truth is, freedom is the most mundane thing imaginable. This is me now. But it's also hard to locate and rarely pure. All marginalized people inhabit two worlds at the same time, those of freedom and non-freedom. Being unfree is different than being in bondage. In bondage, as in the case of enslavement, one's body is owned by someone else. Being unfree, on the other hand, is what happens after the end of enslavement. One becomes an emancipated citizen in the society that used to enslave her and that is still built to do so, without a literal title on one's body, but still with the power to destroy that body, threaten it, circumscribe it, categorize it, and imprison it. Should we, post-bondage, focus on the ways in which we're free, free to move, free to buy, free to breathe, or the ways we're not free, free to move but displaced and shuffled around, free to buy but within a capitalist system in which one used to exist as commodity, free to breathe but in a special danger at all times? Neither. To locate liberation, one has to locate a third space. This altered space is not outside of, away from, or other than our present world. Instead, it is an intensification or deepening of mundane reality. In a skit that aired during a 2013 episode of the Eric Andre Show, the comedian Eric Andre is showed dressed as an NYPD cop, handcuffed to a lamppost with his pants down around his ankles. He begs people from the crowd forming around him to help him pull up his pants. Mocking his masculinity, his authority, Andre makes himself vulnerable to passers-by who look on with a mix of piteous humor and disturbed concern. A black man posing as a failed cop, handcuffed to a phallic post, both assumes the identity of an oppressor and makes a mockery of that oppressor. The crowd of black witnesses to Andre's prank don't exactly enjoy a moment of catharsis at seeing the disempowered and emasculated policeman. They're trying to figure out whether they should be afraid of Andre. At one point, one man warns the others not to touch him, or if they should help him. The viewers do enjoy the opportunity, however, to intervene in their daily lives with a kind of power otherwise unseen. The temporary release from the mundane provided by the occasion to assist a cop in an embarrassing predicament is also a heightening of the mundane. Andre's vulnerability introduces softness, humanity, and tenderness as embodied by his nudity, where before in the masculine authoritative ideal there was none. We could describe this performance by Andre as a deliberate misperformance of an archetype of heteronormative masculinity that then frees us from that ideal by exposing it as farcical. In Aria Dean's video essay for Dis magazine, Eulogy for a Black Mass, Dean describes the image of blackness as a haunting. Memes have something black about them, she says. The something is complicated and hard to make recognizable. It has to do with a lot of black people making memes. On screen, Dean shows memes that show black people dancing, laughing, and enjoying each other's company, while her voice describes a pernicious cycle of images of black people circulating around the internet in a self-referential loop. Can we bilaterally think blackness through memes and memes through blackness? Both smear, mar, blur ontological integrity, she concludes. What the video essay as a form reveals to us is the conversational potential of the essay itself. When the essay works as an art object, a poetic object, or an experiment in video, it is an interview that we come into with an artist. Losing the need to adhere to merely logocentric explication, we come into the possibility of arriving at truth through the integration of thought and sense. The wisdom of the poetic essay is its capacity for aesthetic mystery. In Art as Experience, John Dewey argues that artists use their chosen media as a means to physicalize an internal thinking process. Responding to Keats' idea of negative capability, he writes, in spite of the elliptical character of Keats' statements, 2 points emerge. One of them is his conviction that reasonings have an origin like that of the movements of a wild creature toward its goal, and they may become spontaneous, instinctive, and when they become instinctive, are sensuous and immediate, poetic. The other side of this conviction is his belief that no reasoning, that is, as excluding imagination and sense, can reach truth. Using the tools of computer and social technology, film and video, Black digital media artists like Sandra Perry, Kevin Jerome Everson, American artist, and Martine Sims have showed us the powerful possibilities of using art to think through racism, oppression, and subsequently liberation. How might we learn from the techniques used by these artists to reconceive of a Black avant-garde that uses technology as a language in which to speak about embodiment? Shortly after publishing a collection of poems, Take the Stallion, in 2016, I was hungry for another way to express myself. I looked to video as a medium for what I couldn't find in poetry. I guess I'm going to try to transition to this video. My friend. Sorry. I looked to video as a medium for what I couldn't find in poetry. Poets have a lot of tools for controlling rhythm, cadence, and even speed, but duration in print media is elusive and hard to grasp. In video poetry, I can ask a question and make it last a long time. I can say things really quickly. I can prolong a moment for as long as it needs prolonged. In conceiving of a 24-hour video poem called The Lovers Are the Audience Who Watch, I wanted to try to imagine what it would be like to stare into the eyes of a loved one for 24 hours. The video sequence is constructed from found footage, largely taken from music videos and art documentaries on YouTube, where there is a central figure, the artist, who is being watched by an audience, us. I borrowed the title of the piece from a line of poetry by Juliana Huxtable in her collection, Mucus is My Pineal Gland. She writes, the lovers are the audience who watch, hypnotized by the sublimity of production. Laughter is cued when one of the girls shits or bleeds on the other. The show ends when the trifecta have convincingly orgasmed. The girls stand in a row, have all makeup removed by their corresponding man, take a bow and walk off stage in silence. Is the clit the origin, and am I just a slut? Mucus in My Pineal Gland doesn't present itself as a series of cohesive object ideas, i.e. poems, but rather as a colloquium of voices. For that reason, something feels wrong about calling her book a poetry collection. Huxtable's poems feel more like Tumblr posts that straddle narrative poetry, speculative fiction, and archival document. They maneuver space, time, and genre. Though there are the occasional moments of lineated verse, Huxtable uses, in her words, a visual language castrated of its grammatical structure. The majority of the text is in all caps with section titles like Divine Bitches, made up of prose blocks that extend for pages on end. Huxtable's loose and copious syntax and morphing typographical landscape serve as the engines by which body and text and body become interchangeable with one another. Like the parts of the body, syntactical grammar relies on a structure within which its meaning resides. Flesh is the threshold that speaks and that is called upon whenever you refer yourself to me or I to you. Huxtable maps the body's planes and passageways while at the same time drafting a map of what it means to make physical contact with someone else or to hide from that contact. What does it mean to make contact with a poetic speaker? It's pink inside the blackest stretch of flesh-toned plains where the goosebumps take permanent residence between ridges that hide the moon, writes Huxtable in the poem Morning Light on My Skin. With keen awareness of the body as a physical landscape, Huxtable deconstructs the experience of embodiment down into tones, textures, and planes. I'm just going to take a drink of water. For Dewey, the materials that make up our art objects in themselves are not meaningful, but the way that they converge in a work of art is. The medium in which, or the mechanism by which materials converge is emotion, a kind of sense-making. Different from the discrete ideas of happiness, sadness, excitement, and anger, emotion here is an amalgamation of qualities. Our senses, our sense organs, provide to us information about the qualities that make up emotion. This information, in tandem with intellectual activity, that is, ideas in language, constitute our entire apparatus for world building. Truth is made and destroyed by the collective work of these two faculties. And if it's true that we can't arrive at sense without if it's true that we can't arrive at truth without the input of the sense organs, then If it's true that we can't arrive at truth without the input of the sense organs, then artists, who usually enjoy a keen sensory life, have special tools for learning and researching the external world that non-artists may or may not have. In particular, Black artists have at their disposal these means of self-discovery and a distinct path towards psychic congruence, even in the face of ongoing psychological trauma caused by racism and racist encounters. For an art practice to lead to congruence, an artist adopts an all-seeing eye or an all-hearing ear. For an art praxis to lead to congruence, an artist adopts an all-seeing eye or an all-hearing ear that lights up the internal world and allows some fact or facet of it to materialize. They carry an insight, but also an external sense that negotiates public and private meaning. This external sense, rather than a burden, is like a kind of proprioception, allowing the artist to know where her body is in space, where her ideas fall in relation to other ideas. Integration happens in degrees. The right work of art, one that settles the large divide between joy and tragedy within me, provides me with an opportunity each time I meet it. What is the experience of psychic coherence? The cessation of thought, a flow state, the opening of the senses to their maximum potential. In experiences of coherence, the meaning of one's existence is self-evident if inarticulable. Language and afterthought displaces this incoherence. Language and afterthought always arises out of some incoherence between self and world or self and other. Language displaces this incoherence, relocating it to some less troubled site or site of meaning. Like a disease we can finally name, our troubles seem to wane if we can make them, with our words, disappear. Think of the things you like. What draws you to them? What emotions do you feel in their presence? These are the objects that lie between you and coherence. It's not that desire is bad, quite the opposite. It's that desire is a tool for grasping what remains still unincorporated in you. What kinds of conversations do you want to have today? If the media we use are the tools by which we physicalize ourselves, how will you choose to become? By what means? Through which medium? What do you need to say? Can you figure out how to say it to the person who needs to hear it? Actually, that's it. Okay. Hi. Stakes is high. Thank you, Sean. Sean is on the case. It's very official. He is very official and efficient. Poetry, the body, the manifesto. It is a great pleasure to muse with my colleagues here on relating poetry and the poetic imagination to the essay and manifesto. My new book, Who Do With Words, is called a manifesto.
because I want to be clear about its advocacy, its subjectivity, its passion. It's semi-autobiographical and about philosopher J.L. Austin, blurreddom, and Black power. This essay is about it, me, my process in writing my first essay book, and what I hope to achieve in this fledgling effort. I should also say it is dedicated to Fred Moten and my brother. This book was tough to write because it makes plain some of the more subtly worded raisons d'etre from my writing poems, essays, and now this new thing. As my 7th written or edited book, I hope it's lucky. As embodiment, it's my heart on my sleeve. It's my heart on my arm without covering, my pulse. As the first part of a triptych of writings on J.L. Austin, I can't help but frame this conversation as a trinity too. Heart, mind, spirit, manifesto, essay, poem. I am, of course, making up these categories. They are interchangeable and none of them is real. Their constructions, like race, gender, and time, are human-made, and yet, because we act on these constructions, the implications, the perlocutions are real. Let's try it again. Heart, mind, spirit. Locution, illocution, perlocution. I'm gonna let me finish, but meaning, intent, effect. Once more, what I feel, manifesto. What I think, essay. What the results are, a poem. These 3 categories, this 3-card Monty does not, of course, offer an order. This is non-linear. I've gone over several drafts in my comments today, and that means tossing and turning, not watching and watching TV, eating and not eating, worrying. I think we're all worried. And worry, as academics, we overthink and overkill. How many drafts of a dissertation? How many drafts of a paper? What's this draft like? Boy, it was drafty yesterday. In How to Do Things with Words, J.L. Austin permutates on the word mean, as in meaning about 3 times. Meaning in terms of definition, in terms of intention, in terms of effect. What he really meant was to contrast what actually happened. What Austin does not do is refer to mean as cruelty, probably why I like him. The ellipsis expression, I mean, is a search for the middle, for this balance. I realized this morning that there was embedded in all of this, the golden mean. Between poetry and manifesto is the essay. So I guess this is what this commentary is. This essay refers to a manifesto based on poems. The poems seek to concentrate, to articulate the primary human knowing through utterance of the extraordinary. The manifesto seeks to articulate passion, explicating the mundane. So what is this essay? As How to Do Things with Words offers, there isn't one right answer, only categories that get us closer to what we mean. This essay became an explanation of a book I wrote you haven't read yet. As it was raining outside yesterday, I remember the performance Derek Jacobi did as Lear at BAM a couple years ago. He whispered the "blow, winds, blow" monologue. He chose to perform it in secret. Being Jacobi, it could be heard in the pin-drop clarity of the back of the house. The poetics of dramatic poetry to amplify and silence the wind, to harness this element, reminded me of what the poem cannot do. It cannot mean anything. An essay's purpose is to mean something, in this case to serve as a mean between poem and manifesto, but not to be me, which a manifesto or poem can do, what I have done in poems, and in this manifesto book, maybe, but that was not its intention, not what I mean. Writing my first manifesto was difficult because I didn't want to appear to be mean, even if my effort to be meaningful hurt feelings. Will those feelings be hurt? I'm putting out feelers in this essay. I realize what I want, what most, if not all people want, is joy, is happiness. And one tries not to reach for this at anyone else's expense. This is what I go through all the time, trying to say different things in different contexts, poem, essay, manifesto, rather than other things, singing, acting, professing. Happiness as a construct, as a meaning, is vague, and Austen makes it vaguer in this book by talking about speech performances that don't work as unhappy or infelicitous. He talks about being unhappy more than about being happy, about failure more than success, and I guess I'm doing that too. Don't we do that? Isn't that what academia is all about, brooding? I feel that our predisposition to show smarts is encapsulated in the speech acts, yeah, but I do this too, sometimes in poems, essays, and songs. I wondered where this disposition might come from. For me, it feels like a disengagement with the body. You're always in your head, I've said to myself more than once. It may or may not have been said about me behind my back. When said behind my back, it's outside. When said to myself, where is it? In my sound poetry, the answer is viscera. In my poetic imagination, the meaning is clearly acting inside out. Vibrate the organs, the breathing ones, to touch the ones in you, to go beyond literal meaning and into the indescribable, transcendent, and universal sound pitch. The omnitexts that vibrate everything. Out of one's head, out of one's mind, is where the poetic imagination resides in some way. The body is taken into account with the physics of poetics. What I'm seeking in the essay that's harder to get to in that form is embodied practice, embodied statements that are not constative because they reverberate. And Austen says that this is what all statements do when they do things, which they all do. And that's why constative ultimately fails. Reverberation is doing. Reverberation is the body's permission to speak for itself. But what of the speaking of others? This particular inhabited body is constated as female, black, short, African-American, Brooklynish, grown, bookish, dreadlocked. Do I look like a poet, an academic, a sibling, somebody's child, a scholar, somebody's teacher? The embodiment works in and out, and I guess when I say I wear my heart on my sleeve, on my arm in a manifesto book, I mean the viscera is outside of me, but can it live there? Is it, in another Jacobean role, vicious? Maybe sometimes on the outside. On the inside, I'm always trying to get at that thing. Some call it that music. Whatever it is, it's poetic. I'm reaching in and out, up and down, through and through. All these efforts engage the senses, to reference Susan Stewart's book. When one is not saying words, when one bypasses the heart, if you will, of the constative, one gets to the heart of the performative, hopefully, or at least the arm or the sleeve of the performative. The poem is the synecdoche of language rather than the etiolation of language. This is where Austen and I disagree. Outside of the chest, the heart can be harmed, but we also see how red it is, how it beats. In the manifesto, one could say the same thing, but we usually, when exposed to righteous stridency, say, that took guts. Less glamorous and smellier than the heart sometimes, but showing the unpleasant insides without equivocation is what is intended, the elocution of that statement. The intention of Who Do with words is to reach a more mainstream Black audience and to make things plain, to tell a few hard truths. Less poetics and more exposure, less for academics, but more for non-academic Black nerds and others. Socialized female, I don't want to hurt feelings, and that often gets us into female trouble. Gut-wrenching is what I would call this book, wrenching my own guts, and therefore it is much like sound poetry in the way it feels in me, the perlocutionary aspect, rather than what it may seem like to others. Divorced from the primary impulse towards economy, as I am in page-based poetry, and to an extent sound poetry, the manifesto's plaintive nature and this essay's attempt to explain it are anti-aesthetical to my poetic tendencies, and therefore this manifesto is freeing. It attempts to assert the freedom of others like me, Whereas a poem can emphasize ways to not speak, this essay I'm speaking now is saying a whole bunch of things, none of which are implied. One thing I am understanding what essays do is to go in the polar opposite direction of what I'd like to do as a poet with the same idea. A manifesto is making an assertion, and that is also not what I'm doing right now in this essay. It is not a force in that way, or the way that Austen uses forces either. It's an offering of an idea as a series of statements of some type. To riff on the current Black behavitive, what I'm not gonna do is use my manifesto to dominate, hopefully, but to assert. If I'm trying to do anything in it, and in this long preface to it, it is to assert empowerment without repression and with passion. I wrote Hoodoo with Words as a manifesto on Black freedom. We do this in many non-Austinian ways, including song as manifesto, like the ring shout. It rings out. Although not the etymology of the term, the ring shout uses the pacing, the pulsing syncopation to reverberate, and if there is metal and glass in the room, that includes ringing. The manifesto reverberates through passion rather than through sound, or at least it does for me in this first effort. The targeted audience of blurs, Black nerds, later includes others of goodwill. The focus of the book for Black audiences is a form of performance to find the golden mean in myself too. This essay is a preface, as I said. I think about being a Black academic, and here we are in the Ivy Leagues. In the academy, the intimacy of being the right person in the right environment with the right credentials, and that usually means being acceptable in the right social environments. I investigate that construct as a way of balancing the perception outside of my body about who I am. I assert my fundamental self pre-academic-y and pre-avant-garde core, a sickly baby blurred in the projects with my blurty sibling, our early meanings and sounds before my adoption into other less Black contexts that have embraced me. We are on the margins. And we, on the margins, are always reintroducing ourselves, sometimes outing ourselves, sometimes saying what we mean by what we appear to as others. In a couple days, when Hoodoo with Words is ready to be seen in the flesh, maybe some of this may make sense, maybe it won't. This commentary is what is on my mind, and I realize that I want to be happy to convey happiness. And as I said in the introduction to another book, universal love and care for everyone. That's what the book is about, even though it's not necessarily what it gives off. What I have learned as a poet is to accept what the writing means, whether or not it is what I want it to mean. There is a higher intention besides being liked, being acceptable. It's telling the truth as best as one can. One facet of it with passion, asserting what is meaningful, a manifesto. Here I talk about J.L. Austin's Speech Act theory through aspects of Black power through blurred culture. I wrote this book because the traditional academic post-thesis book did not serve my passion for the project. It felt too square. So instead, I'm writing 3 books, one on heart, this first one for mind, the second one, and one for spirit, the more open-ended third. The first book is embodiment, but through an ephemeral symbol, the heart. The heart is the core of the manifesto. Looking outside myself, I again considered the Abominus Manifesto by Bob Kaufman and African Signs and Spirit writing by Harriet Mullen. One's a poem and one's an essay, but I feel that they both reflect the best that manifestos can be because they both express passion in seeking truth to power, with wry wit on top of everything, something I cannot claim but aspire to. Almost all our work as Black poets, as marginalized people, is political because our embodiment makes these words mean particular things. They inhabit us and reflect us, and therefore embody our particular situation. That is, we are affirming ourselves to ourselves, while simultaneously being forced that word again, to proving our fundamental human nature, to prove our existence to others. It is always being questioned by those who have more say. Do we exist as people? Should we? And this is where I leave you. My musings, and I do defer to my muse, irrespective of form, affirm our light, goodness, humanity, beingness in all utterances and ways of being, and reframing Malcolm X a little, by all means being necessary. Thank you.
It is an honor to be here. When Dottie invited me, I immediately thought poet and essay, and I thought José Martí. So I'm going to open this essay with a quote by José Martí, and I'm going to read the Spanish and the English translation. Cree el aldeano vanidoso que el mundo entero es su aldea, y con tal de que él quede de alcalde, o que le mortifique al rival que le quitó la novia, o le crezcan en la alcancía los ahorros, ya da por bueno el orden universal, sin saber de los gigantes que llevan 7 lenguas en las botas, y le pueden poner la bota encima, ni de la pelea de los cometas en el cielo que van por el aire dormido engullendo mundos. Lo que queda de aldea en América ha de despertar. Estos tiempos no son para acostarse con el pañuelo a la cabeza, sino con las armas de almohada, como los varones de Juan de Castellanos, las armas del juicio que vencen a las otras. Trincheras de ideas valen más que trincheras de piedra. The vain townsman thinks the whole world is his town, and as long as he gets to be mayor, as long as he mortifies the rival that took his girl, or his savings grow in the piggy bank, all's right with the universal order, having no knowledge of the giants that carry 7 tongues in their boots, and can push him down with that boot, nor of the comet's celestial war, comets that fly through the sleeping air swallowing worlds. What is left of the town in America must awaken. These days aren't for wearing blinders. They are gun under the pillow days, like Juan de Castellanos' soldiers, the weapons of the final judgment that beat the rest. Trenches forged with ideas are worth more than trenches made of stones. José Martí, Our America. Section 1. If I call Martí brother, or even say his brotherhood had no room for me, am I not seeing difference where he saw a putting down of glasses and a raising of weapons? How long is the sentence in an Antillean essay? How long can we draw out our conceits, thinking them only metaphors, really, only ways of speaking ourselves into history that may or may not have room? For all the piggy banks and vaults are full of medals, stolen from the Arawaks, torn by Juan de Castellanos' dogs, and yes, under the pillow are the guns, next to the doors are the bats, on the fridge is the escape plan, within the fascism are the colonies, twisting with the colony is the foil of neo-empire, old stories, sort of, old poems. And the trenches, oh, the paper trenches, are either lists of safe houses or instructions on how to never answer certain knocks, ways of writing ourselves into an us forever beyond the scope of this writing. What does it take to write? Martí wrote by candlelight in New York, making, as Lola Rodriguez Dio wrote, Cuba and Puerto Rico, of the same bird 2 wings. Because let's be real, this naturalness was written, this solidarity is not effortless. What then is this moment when by candlelight, Puerto Rico washes clothes with the dirty waters Martí once used, but with different bodies, and breaking over these changes, these differences in century, dying over these differences, when most of the island is still without light? How should I read this enlightened Antillano, not being us, not being himself, and know it is the poetry, or whatever that means, that gives me some flight and some crash as well? In his essay on Martí's prologue to the Niagara poem by Juan Antonio Pérez Bonalde, Julio Ramos argues that Martí's, quote, aesthetic poetical political drive, end quote, exceeds the performance of knowledge enacted by the modern critical exercise. Ramos argues that in the prologue, Martí, and I quote, reflects on poetry as the art of the crisis of the subject, and that at the same time, the figurative density of the prologue confirms the aesthetic political horizon of a new gaze, a poetic mode of enunciating and of authorizing the discourse about the crisis of experience that drives modernity, end quote. This authorization happens through metaphor, which, quote, for Martí is a way of putting together the fragments of a body in a fractured totality, end quote. But Ramos also believes, if I find this, but Ramos also believes, sees in beauty a quote, democratic force through which future beauty comes into being. Unlike his contemporaries, Martí saw in beauty an alternative set of values that prized things that were not seen as useful, values tied to, quote, sensibility that had been impacted by the instrumentalizing logic of capitalism, end quote. And so I meet Martí at the crossroads where he is both hell-bent on paper trenches, when so many Boricuas have no light with which to write, no time or desire, and where he is also so sweet, ready to ask for us to have light, to have the space to love, to desire, to enact beauty. A temporal crossroads much like writing to the dead, writing to those who cannot read him, a gesture both naive in its privilege and sincere in its excess, its desire to undo itself through the writing, an act either forever trapped in the narrowest of presents or written for some future reader, a crossroads where he writes as if giving a speech only broken-fisted angels can interpret. Section 2. On Sunday, February 11th, an ex-professor wrote to let me know that the administration at the Maya West campus of the University of Puerto Rico was considering putting a moratorium on the comparative literature program. From late September until that evening, I had been helping evacuees come to Philadelphia and had seen, heard, and experienced too much. Yet I had somehow kept it together. Yo visto el águila herida volar al azul sereno y morir en su guarida la víbora del veneno. Oculto mi pecho bravo la pena que me lo hiere, el hijo de un pueblo esclavo vive por él, calla y muere. It's Martí. But this was a new poison, one I hadn't slowly been exposed to. This was the program where I first read Chip Delaney, Robert Reed Farr, and Paul Preciado, where I learned about Colombian Nadaísta poets, and where I wrote and performed queer plays with a group of young queer performers. I became a poet there, read theory in a way that allowed me to push against some of the built-in limitations of being an organizer in a colony where we can only afford so much speculation. I broke down crying. These were not paper trenches. These were apartments, parks, spaces we opened up for people we didn't know we'd soon lose. Places where we discuss Angela Maria Dávila, organize the student assembly that approved the strike, and rehearse. This was El Colegio. Many of us had part-time jobs, were working class and broke, and depended on the Pell Grant. Everything we read was measured against this, what it could offer or detract from our desire to keep living. To believe in things that were deemed useless meant we had to argue for their usefulness on a campus that specialized in engineering and prepared biology students to work for pharmaceutical companies. We had to call our verses paper trenches, even when they weren't, because to call them paper sculptures wouldn't keep out the rain. I'm still bad at this, at advocating for poetry as something that not only I need, but that we need. And it's probably because I'm not sure it's true. We can survive without poetry, and we can survive without knowing how to read and write. It is possible. For too long, we've been crafting answers to arguments posed by our enemies. Rather than ask if we can survive without poetry, why not ask why we are always calculating the necessary minimum for survival? What if we march to the world with military excess, saying, I will take a future where there is too much poetry, over a present where we are constantly have to advocate for our right to dream? Section 3. In Women, Creole Identity and Intellectual Life in Early 20th Century Puerto Rico, Magali Roy Fequiere notes that cultural nationalism, a nationalist ideology that prioritizes the formation of national cultural and an essentializing Puerto Ricanness in lieu of political independence of the nation-state, interpolates the Puerto Rican writer to fulfill a contract in which the writer is asked to perform, quote, the awesome task of being a guarantor of the existence of their culture, end quote. She calls this demand an enduring ethical dictum, and attributes it with the continuance of a cultural nationalist literary tradition and a parallel counter-discursive tradition that has documented its dominance. The Generación del 30, the generation of the 30s, which consisted of ex-landowning class of hacendados, after being displaced by US absentee capitalists, offered cultural nationalism as a way of saving Puerto Rican culture from political and economic bankruptcy. In Troy Fikiri's words, quote, to counter the all-encompassing sense of social and cultural dislocation, the intelligentsia proposed to discover anew Puerto Rico's national character in order to affirm the existence of the nation and to prove the discourses that would buttress new political projects, end quote. In Puerto Rico, poets write essays. We advocate from the poems. We load the forms until they sink to a bottom where silt and time make them indistinguishable. There is all this writing, poems, essays, history books, novels, writing thrown into the pit of the future, questions phrased as definite statements, as visions, prophecies of paper, not of stone. We have an excess of excess. First, we have generic proliferation, which is our reiterant response to the failure of an emancipatory cultural nationalist project. If only this time we could say it in just the right way, so our words would legally travel to the mainland and ring in the ears of absentee capitalists. This kind of excess makes it so that we have many essays, poems, stories, and plays that often form part of the same conversation, centered around who we are and how we can finally be free. It also makes it so our poems, stories, and plays often sound like essays. Then there is the aesthetic, poetical, political drive that exceeds the performance of knowledge enacted by the modern critical exercise, as Ramos kind of sees Martí, no? This kind of excess makes our essays sound like poems. Beauty is a democratizing force, a unifying quality that lets us shine through despite and beyond colonialism. Finally, there is the excess of writing itself, the crossroads where Martí and I intersect and diverge. A suspicious commodity, in the latter part of the 20th century, Puerto Rican poets went from being champions of a cultural nationalist project to unnecessary expenditures. This kind of excess makes the writing feel all the more urgent. True, the fight against the privatization of beaches and the fight against the elimination of a comparative literature program are separate, and the impulse to compare them is rooted in class and racial differences. But after the Promesa Bill was passed, neoliberal efforts that had been fragmented were consolidated. In the span of a few months, the minimum wage and the university budget were both slashed, though with varying effects. The Puerto Rican bourgeoisie, under the auspices of US imperial interests, has long insisted that we sacrifice for an imagined community, with a very unimagined leadership. It takes a certain amount of privilege to believe education is a privilege, even if you are using that idea to argue it shouldn't be. For although much of our knowledge has been privatized through institutions, in Puerto Rico, those universities have often played a radicalizing role. Literature, history, and philosophy classrooms have been where many young working-class Boricuas first felt permission to explore possibilities beyond survival, beyond the bare bones of stripped-down trees, ravaged by the hurricane of unending poverty and colonial oppression. Rather than argue that literature is a necessary excess, I'd like to embrace excess on its own terms. We are already excessive, supplemental, and contingent. We have been made non-consensually dependent. We are way too much all the time and everywhere. Cultural nationalism bifurcates forms in an attempt to hold back a scream, to colonize a desire to burn down cane fields. But this attempt is more often than not unsuccessful. In her essay on the perilous potential of feminist silence, Karina Elbayesh writes, and I quote, "In Puerto Rico this summer, my voice melted into the melodic din, but its edge sharpens against the performance of white silence, which is not in fact silent. It is a careful repertoire of subdued gestures, coded words, and background expectations about who should speak, when, how, and how much. The unconscious expectation is that words coming from white people, especially white men, are not an interruption, but part of the white noise of our social world, the background track. Latina expressivity is not just a value-neutral cultural norm that appears exaggerated in relation to the different cultural norms of white resistance. It shows up as a form of resistance to the fact that the white valorization of silence, or at the very least, appropriate affect, always seems strictest when it comes from us, end quote. Whiteness, like Jameson's description of the Bonaventure, allows the interlocutor to see without being seen and projects a certain aggressiveness towards and power over an other. It is flat, smooth, digestible, and ductile. The white body is an easy body that purges its bitterness inward. The Boricuas come already marked. We are bad citizens, bad fathers, bad mothers, bad children, bad lovers, bad Americanos. We perform being los más mejores in order to receive prizes and speak in essays, adding our good days to the elegies archive. We are asked to verify our bodies, our voices, and check for the curvature, la greña, la morusa. We are expected to have buenos modales that aim to get rid of malas mañas, a las buenas o a las malas. Bad writing only exists as something signaled, something determined by another imposed text. Las malas palabras rise to the surface with rage, with the tempest, with the tapón, when we hit the bureaucratic wall, when our house floods, when the plumber doesn't arrive and there isn't light in the whole neighborhood. Las malas palabras are cafre. What if we refuse the imperative to write ourselves into colonial methodological traditions? Let's do it. Let's be cafres in the essays and the poems that keep writing too many. Let's dwell on these failed and excessive moments when the, quote, awesome task of being a guarantor of the existence of our culture, end quote, is saturated by the aesthetic, poetical, political drive. The moments when we get too hype. Let's hold on tightly to the belief that we have a right, not just, I don't know what's happening here. What's happening? See, that a little excessive. Not just to survive, but to live excessively, to reclaim the excess that has been stolen. We want it back. And what if we release our daily grief, even for a few hours, and allowed ourselves all the rage and all the future bliss we've been containing? What would that look like? How impossibly fucking beautiful would that be? Thank you.
Thank you to you three for your pieces. And I thought, like last time, I could just ask a couple of questions, and then we could open it up to the group. So Post-it note right here. Got a color code all of the stuff. So just for all of you, I wanted to know how you felt. The idea of a manifesto is both for, of, or against the imagination, and just that idea of why do we make manifestos? Whoever wants to start.
I think about manifestos as places where you can collect a body of ideas that then sort of leads to some further action, for whatever reason, that those ideas are like spurring action. And that can be, for whatever reason, I'm thinking right now of the Mundane Afrofutures Manifesto. I think it's one of my faves. And it's sort of Martinson's undoing all of sort of the conventions that we know about Afrofuturism, so thinking about, what is an Afrofuturism that's not in space or that has nothing to do with galaxies or stars or things, if you pare it back, what remains, and then trying to sort of spur people to act out or maybe even to explore what those things are. I'll leave that.
I think sometimes we just have to say the thing, and the affect and the energy of a manifesto is kind of that feeling of just having to say the thing, except it's a little condensed. But I also really believe that, right, within that framework, you can do a lot, just as you can do a lot within the, like, kind of, if you take genre to be a looser category, or genres to be looser categories, then you can kind of take like an affect and a feeling and you can run with it and you can actually do a lot within it that makes it porous. So I don't know if I'm good for defining as much as like pushing against it. But
I agree with both of my colleagues here. I think one of the speech acts, if you will, that we're talking back to is banality of evil. You know, like sort of passive-aggressive, bureaucratic horror of policy that destroys people. And the manifesto is an assertive, passionate way of speaking against that, because it's a form of gaslighting, right? You didn't really see that. I didn't really say that. It's all, you know, shock and awe, or whatever it is. You know, it's all pithy and it's said in this, you know, stentorial tone. And it's sort of, oh. And then you go, wait, did they just start bomb? Wait, what happened? And so the sort of normalization of harm that actually manifests in policy and law, and also the things that are good about policy and law, lend themselves to, you know, did I just hear that? Whereas the manifesto is unequivocal in the way that one hears. I think one of the things that's interesting, sorry to be Austin standing here, but you know, the way that he talks about law is important in the way that he frames law as a form of doing, not just describing. And Ken and I were having a great conversation about that. I was pre-law. He actually processed and became a lawyer, but how and through law and through poetry and performance, we're doing the same thing. We're like meeting. So, but the manifesto offers another context in which we mean what we say in an unequivocal way, and we don't have to question what it is that we heard because we know what we heard. And like I said, it's not implied; it's stated.
I love that because because it necessitates a certain new form, maybe, unless I guess that's another conversation. If all manifestos are the same form. Because I have that big book over there of manifestoisms, and they feel like they take the same form in some way too. But they're transparent too, so it's.
And that's a choice of the editor also. I remember when that book came out, I was part of the book party for that book. What I noted was that there weren't women of color represented in that book except for one person who felt tokenized, which I said at the party, which was tacky on my part. I also didn't feel well, so I didn't have my filter of, should I? But one of the things that I talk about in this book is the cocktail party and this like the intimate settings where everybody kind of agrees what everybody believes just by being there, and it's like, suppose you don't. So even though I think that book is extremely helpful in thinking about a lot of, it is not an official way of thinking about manifestos. It's a curated way of thinking about a particular type of articulation. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons I mentioned Harriet Mullen and Bob Kaufman is because they're not in that book.
I'm interested in the relationship between curation and something being official. Like I think that's so spot on, you know, in the sense that like if a series of objects have been arranged by, you know, an agent, an official person, then, you know, my relationship to it is such that, you know, I think that it's that no hand has touched it, in fact. You know, like the curator sort of disappears and then it becomes this sort of like objectively great thing, you know.
I should just say before I jump off the mic, that everybody does that. So I'm not like, man, cause for doing that. I'm just noting it since I was invited. I've noted it. But everybody has that subjectivity. So just to be fair to her.
Yeah. And you mentioned teaching, and every teacher as well. I mean, it's the same kind of gesture or something, the subjective gesture that is taken as objective most of the time, or authority. Okay, second question for everyone. Thank you for being excited for my lame questions. What is the imagination? This is something I always want to know. Is it contextless? That's the thing I always want to know. Is it free of context? And is it different for poets than for everyone else? Are we special in the way that it manifests or whatever? Or, yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, sure, like we're special in that we're doing poetry and not what someone else might do. For example, like the dozens, like right in La Decena or La Décima, which are akin to the dozens in Puerto Rico, right, or something that was performed in a town in Añasco where my grandparents are from. And La Décimas are like extremely rhymed, competitive verses that have a very concrete structure, and so most of the people who performed them didn't have to know how to read and write, but they were like, it was just like a pastime, right? Mm-hmm. But like maybe some people weren't into that and they were into doing something else. I don't know, like my uncle's a carpenter, he like is amazing, mm-hmm. Like maybe that's what he does. I mean, I can't do that, right? So like, is it different? Are poets' imaginations different? Yeah, in that we kind of are obsessed with this one thing, and they're kind of, someone else might be obsessed with another thing. And then maybe on a smaller scale, just the way we are in the world is an imaginative exercise often against the very structures that like constantly try and like restrain that. Like even something like seeing figures in clouds is an imaginative exercise. I don't know, like I feel like it is contextual in every case, but like if we're gonna talk about like a human imaginary, the capacity, I do think there's like a capacity to be imaginative that humans have, but it's kind of a broad entry point.
Can I answer your question with a question?
Yeah. Oh, with a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Should I go?
Yeah.
Because I sort of think of the imagination as like completely tied to context. And so then I was like, well, maybe I'm thinking of context differently than Dottie's thinking of it.
Well, I'll just say I think so too. I think it completely tied to context. But I asked the question just to see what you all thought. Sorry, that was my sneaky, manipulative question. Yeah, no, I think it's completely tied to context, but I want to believe in a context-less place that all contexts end up in, i.e. like an after world, which I don't totally believe in. So anyway, that's why I'm asking you all, in the hopes that it'll change my mind. Or solidify my opinions. Anyway, I'll shut up. But what do you think? Okay, yeah, that was the question was the response.
One of the things I wanted to just add, I mean, I think everybody is fundamentally capable of imagination and poetics. I think poetry is foundational to beingness. And it's not just necessarily related to humans, it's being. But one of the things I wanted to just emphasize, had to come to the realization, is that there's a submission, and I submit to this muse situation. I guess that's your after. Mm-hmm. And I love to think that I come up with all these notions and ideas, but I don't. I submit to her. It's unequivocal, and I wish I could take credit for a lot of stuff, but it's her, this other thing, and I'm being whispered to and castigated or whatever, and it's something outside of the ego, because the ego wants me to. I want to look, I want to be liked sometimes, and I want to, sort of put my best front forward, but she's got other things that are more important, and I have to submit to that, because if it becomes about the ego, then the muse stops, saying, oh, you're not listening to me, then go about your merry way. And then you have stuff like writer's block or choking on your words or something like that. So to the extent that there's a poetic imagination, I defer it to this other entity. And I know it's super old school to bring up the muses and stuff, but I really do feel like it's not me and it's not me. It's her. Maybe that's the outside.
Yeah, I agree. Anyway, yeah, so now might be a great time for people to ask questions if they want to in our, we could use this side, we didn't use this side a lot, but does anybody want to ask anything at all? Yeah.
It's going to be okay, nothing bad.
Yeah, okay, yeah, no,
Hi, I just want to thank you all. That was really wonderful. I felt like a common thread in the three presentations was this conversation about, well, starting with Anaïs, who spoke of this third space, the space of liberation, which is not in which marginalized people are either free or unfree. It's this other carved out space, which you called the deepening of mundanities, which I thought was beautiful. But also, Raquel, when you were talking about the closing of the department in Mayagüez and how Puerto Rico has to rely on, Puerto Rican poets and writers have to rely on the weight of poetry, how you can make it look not like poetry and like something essential. I was thinking also of that space. And then Professor Morris, what I loved about yours was, your presentation was the creations of the phrases, I mean, and but, which you called a search for the middle, which I also thought it is a great privilege to be able to rest on that structure and know what's going to be there. I wanted to hear you all talk a little bit more about that space.
One of the things, I guess, thank you for your kind comments and close listening, is going old school. I believe in the nouveau, but I also believe in going old school and not conceding it generationally or in any other kind of way. I feel like in terms of Black power, that it's something to be wrestled with, and something to be wrested from, you know. I talk a bit about that in more detail, like how do we, you know, we're so used to stuff being appropriated that we say, I'm gonna make the new thing, I'm gonna make the new thing. But then we sometimes concede the old things to people who will use it as a device to make us doubt ourselves or to destroy ourselves. And I think that's true of all marginalized people. And so I don't think the muse is necessarily about Greek affect, that's just one term for it or whatever. But, you know, it's not like I'm a Luddite, even though I kind of need to get off social media, but it's like this. Every generation thinks that what they're doing is completely new, and there's a strength in that, but there's a vulnerability of that, and that everything else that is part of their legacy is appropriated and used to disempower them sometimes, I think. So trying to find the mean, the golden mean, which is a very old school phrase, or talking about the muses, or talking about Austin, or talking about Bruce Lee, which I talk about this book, or even using the term Black Power. It's to reclaim and to reshape. And one of the things I got from my colleagues, actually all the colleagues so far, is this fearlessness in terms of negotiating the antiquated with the avant-garde and not feeling like you have to choose, or there's only that there's a binary, because it isn't.
Well, I think that maybe it's just having been an organizer for so many years in Puerto Rico and having to sit down and explain things as we were taught in my ex-organization in Arroz y Habichuela, in rice and beans. But I feel like I really want to start in a place, in a common ground with whoever I'm talking to. And then I want to do the most I can to really be annoying as shit and just kind of edge them towards kind of the brink. And so in that sense, the middle is just the place where two people meet, and my advocating for excess is actually starting there and then just it's just kind of really pushing it somewhere else. Until it's almost unrecognizable. But you can come from a place of complete refusal, and that has a great deal of value. But at this point in my life, I'm trying to like harness all this Tarian energy. So I'm trying to like be really chill and like talk to people more like close. So that's where I am.
My brain went like 18 million places. But I guess that what's happening most immediately for me is thinking about boundaries and, you know, a way in which sometimes we talk about knocking down boundaries as a positive, you know, we're, you know, breaking down walls. And it can be a positive, but also sometimes the disintegration of boundaries is a negative, and there are situations where without boundariness, the possibility for actual contact is broken. Contact as opposed to like merger, for example. And so I really respond to what Raquel was saying about, wait, did you talked about contact, right? Yeah, like maybe this third space or this mundane space is a space where we're both sort of separate but like touching, you know, it's like this you, this me. And perhaps that's happening all the time, you know, but that it just doesn't feel that way or seem that way. I think about like, no, never mind, I'm not gonna go there. But I think about like, you know, living in a place like New York where you see so many people each day, right, and seeing your faces. And in a way, like I feel deeply connected with you, and then also I may never see you again. And so is there a way for that to be meaningful in a lasting way? You know? I don't know, just riffing.
Just looking to see if Kaufman was actually in this book. I know Harriet was not in this book, and there's one woman of color in this whole big old book. I'm trying to see, do you think was Bob Kaufman in this book? Just looking. Oh, okay, I didn't think so, but I wanted to correct the record if that were the case. A lot of great people in here. I just feel like, you know, like I said, in fairness, everybody has their point of view that's important. I think it's Suzanne Césaire is the only black woman in this book. Senghor is in here. But I guess what, you know, because I'm a poet person, it's like to name a book with this title, it seems more encompassing. So I was like, well, it's not encompassing. It is perspectival, and everything is. I don't think I see him in here. And I think I'm trying to develop the discipline to not necessarily be mad all the time, but to be proactive. And one of the things I wanted to affirm was what I love in my first effort here. It's just full of mistakes, and there's going to be no right page for sure. To learn what it is, and it's a declaration of love too. I think most manifestos are, and I think Wayne and was it Wayne? Maybe it was Ken. We were talking about this idea of love and universal love and care, and I just wonder how. It seems like what you all were saying, and what everybody is saying, is asserting this idea of not at the expense of. You know, we affirm something, but not at the expense of a third way, a medium, whatever. So it's making manifest, not manifesto as the noun, but also the verb of making something manifest that we love.
I was just thinking, I love your triptychs or whatever that you set up with the heart being the manifesto. I wrote it down, I don't have it like memorized. But yeah, no, I love how you kept like making 3 things and they were all setting up to work against each other.
I kept failing at writing this daggone post-freaking dissertation book. Everybody says you have to write right after you finish your dissertation. Fred Moon. No, he didn't say that. He didn't get on me, but he was encouraging. And I was just like, I can't do it. I wrote 3 poetry books, but I couldn't get to, and I was like, why? And I was like, oh, because it was trying to put too much in it. Yeah. So it was, you know, school of hard knocks, constant failure, and we should not be afraid of failure either, by the way. Austin talks a lot about failure and helped me to embrace that instead of being perfect and this pressure to overcompensate when you're marginalizing to be perfect because you're judged so much more harshly.
And why can't the poetry book be the dissertation book? I mean, why does it have to be a certain form that, I'm just, you know.
Yeah, that's another, well, I guess a creative PhDs.
Yeah.
But they separate those.
Do you write for an audience?
Excuse me?
Do you write for an audience?
Do I what?
Write for an audience.
Do I write for an audience?
Yeah. Yeah. All of us.
No. You're implied in your question is several things. I feel your passion to respond to a lot of things that you're working through, and I feel like a good direct discourse. But you've asked a couple of questions off the mic, which implies a privilege of space, you know? That makes this a 2-person conversation, because I can hear you, but it's not for the record. So I appreciate that passion, but it's an interesting sort of choice. I don't write for an audience because it implies a certain sort of relationship to the ego that I've had to release. I write what I feel like I have to write, whether there's an audience for it or not. And I have very good experimental poets that I bow to in that way, like Nate Mackey, like Bob Kaufman, like Harriet, like Fred. You offer, but I don't know if it's to. I think it's offering. And an offering is if you think about it as a gesture, is like this, whereas to is like this. And it may fail, but I have to do it anyway. There's something knocking on my head that tells me to do this thing, and it's whether or not I want to. So it's not for an audience, it's in supplication.
So I promised I wasn't gonna get too hyped, but I'm gonna try. I'm trying to do the middle ground thing, you know, like that Aristotelian golden mean, that shit that, you know, went straight into Catholicism, was just like hammered on my head, like most of my life, like the middle ground, right? So I'm trying that without associating it with like my grandmother. And just like this sense of just like don't be gay or whatever, or like be gay but not too gay or whatever the fuck. So I want to come back to this idea of like what we're allowed to express and how loudly or how extensively in the essay, this like 5-paragraph essay. Because in Latin America, right, that is not, people don't do that, right? Our best essayists don't write 5-paragraph essays. They write beautiful, long, elaborate essays that are way better than anything that can be taught in a composition course, and they would like kill it here. So like this idea of like following this like composition shit that like gets taught in like 1st grade English all the way up till you graduate, that sort of American thing, really to me is like the way that like white Americans like cook chicken with just put a little salt and pepper, like they don't know how to cook. You know, that's what I'm saying. Like y'all need flavor in your life, and I don't mean like shit you appropriate. I mean like you don't have it. It's not built into you. And so like to break down form, like form as an abstraction, or like the essay is something that you got taught in your school in the US as a white American, and go back and think about how provincial that is in relation to the rest of the world that's been writing essays since before you were born. Like that's the kind of shit where I'm like, really? Like, you're gonna come here and you're gonna talk about that. Of all the things that the US has given the world, which many of them are bad, like the one thing you're gonna fixate is on this thing. That's where I like don't get it, you know what I mean? That's where I like can't really vibe it, I don't know. Anyways, sorry. I got hype anyways.
Hi, thank you all. I feel very activated in this thing. I don't usually ask a question, that's not really my way. So this is gonna be kind of clumsy. But I just was thinking, I guess, you know, Dr. Morris, as you were talking about the manifesting, and then, you know, Anaïs, with your project, I feel like there's this kind of like, I don't know, like metaphysical, like interdimensional quality to the manifesto that I feel like is implied in what everybody is talking about, but nobody's necessarily like saying it. And I don't know if that's just academia and you're not allowed to say that or what, but I'm just curious if you guys could speak just a little bit to like the magic, like, you know, if you feel like you might be like, you know, doing some magic with these kinds of forms.
Hi, wifey. Yeah? I don't know. Yes?
I mean, like, manifesting things or, you know, creation feels sort of like a kind of magic. So I think about, yeah, I don't know, I guess it's an interesting thing to sort of try to speak directly to the magic, because it sort of is like, almost like the ground that we're all standing on, you know, is magic, and then like this is what happens from that place. I don't know if that is making sense, but it's almost like, yeah, the magic is what brings us here, is what allows us to sort of speak to each other in this way. Yeah.
Well, it's a great question. It's a very loaded, obviously, question. You know, the etymology is always fun to sort of nerd out on, right? Spelling, right? So before Gutenberg and all of that, when it's sort of universalizing literacy, it was magic, right? To utter something, to be incantatory is the heart of poetics. And the economy of poetics, the reverberation of poetics works very well in metaphysics, which is why so much of metaphysical writing is poetic, because it's got something extra in the intention and the power of words, not just literally, but in their utterance, the sounds of the utterances and all of that. As I'm approaching this notion of omnitext, a sonic omnitext, as a sound poet in another ways. I think that's there. I don't have a problem with that conversation. The thing that I try to consider, though, is how that leaves out people who don't engage in text that way. Humanists, atheists, and agnostics, for example, who are doing something that is quite metaphysically profound in terms of their relationship to humanness and beingness, that's not dissociated with a higher power or what they consider any kind of power, but still has that resonance, like, while I'm on earth, this is what I will do to support. So that's the only reason why I'm cautious. But yeah, I think the origins of poetics and of language comes from people saying, what hath God wrought, in a way, trying to figure it out and say it in order to be part of it. So yeah. But it's a great question, and I'm glad you framed it the way you did about people being afraid of saying it because academia doesn't allow for that. But if we sort of say, instead of what you believe, what's the heart of where this comes from, then people can sort of be in it and be analytical or passionate about it in that way.
Yeah, we probably have time for one more question.
Hello, thanks so much to all of you. In a way, this is sort of following up on things that have already been opened up. But I guess I'm wondering about the essay as a social genre. Anaïs, I was thinking about how you framed your presentation as the essay as conversation. And Dr. Morris, so much of your essay felt also like a conversation with yourself, like sort of dramatizing the ways we socialize with ourselves. And Raquel, it was from a context of organizing too, that you were having these reflections. And I thought about the fact that I know, at least Raquel, I think for everybody here, everybody was solicited, solicited to write an essay. And sometimes we get solicited to write poems, but more often we get solicited to write essays. There's an economy of essay writing. And I was wondering how you think of the social dimension of the essay and how it's different for you, or if it's different from you, from the social dimension of the poem, or the essay as a social space, something like that. Thank you.
For me, the essay was the only way I could deal with theory or come close to academia, because I just hate so much of the way in which academic writing is framed. And the essay was like the only thing that I could kind of like be a poet in and still engage with theory in a way that felt like nonviolent to myself.
Sorry, I'm still thinking about the sociality, like if there's like the tiny sociality of like I can conjure up other people in my mind, or people are passing through my mind as I'm writing, or something like that. And then there's like this. I think that like before reading the thing I read, I practiced it, which I never practiced reading a poem. And so I'm sort of thinking still about what it means to kind of rehearse an essay but not a poem. And there's something about, even in this context, right, like I think I had some anxiety about like an urgency behind like needing to communicate clearly, and even as I was like, what does that mean? You don't need to do that, or how are these other ways that you can think about it? There's still, I think, for me, attached to the essay, like a very strong desire to sort of, pass a message. Where with a poem, like, I think my desires around what the poem will do are totally different.
It's fraught because the origins of my writing come from being in isolation as a sick person, as a young sick person. So I'm comfortable with my own thoughts and keeping my own company. But there's also a responsibility that one has once one becomes a teacher and once one puts one's work out in the world, for people to matter and not matter. It's just framing that in a way in which approval it's not about approval, but what one offers to, out of love, to hopefully make the world one wants to see, is fraught and it's complex.
Well, I hate to end this conversation, but the good news is we still have more to go. But right now we're going to take a little break. So we have some time if you want to go to the exhibition or just, hang around here or go outside, save your ticket or whatever. And we're going to come back at 4:30 for our next panel called